Welcome, adventurers. Today on Rebel Then King, we are going to close out the combat tactics video series by going over 10 advanced tips, topics, themes, tactics. There is going to be something for everyone. We've got stuff for your marshals, for your ranged, for your melee, for your casters, for support, buffing, debuffing, everything. The first tip is that the fight starts before the fight starts. Remember exploration activities? And I'm talking to me and my other players when I ask that question, because we used to do these all the time, and I don't think we do anymore, and we really should. Rather than just blindly running into a room or just being very cautious and, opening a door and hoping nothing bad happens, there are actually mechanical activities called exploration activities that you can take as you are moving around in your dungeon or your castle or whatever it happens to be. Are you a tanky fighter with a shield? Well, you can defend. That is an actual activity. What happens? Well, you will enter combat with your shield raised. That's a lot better than having your big, useful shield just sitting down, not being used when you have poor initiative and the other characters, the enemies, get to attack you in that first round. You can scout at the start of your very next encounter. Every creature in your party gains a +1 circumstance bonus to their initiative rolls. Just by saying, hey, I'm scouting, everyone gets a +1. You can avoid notice. You can use stealth for your initiative and possibly avoid being detected as combat begins. The other thing about beginning the fight before the fight begins is that you don't have to use your perception for initiative. You can make a case for using one of your better skills for this. So maybe you are a low wisdom and low perception build. Well, maybe you're a rogue and you want to double down on stealth and use avoid notice, like I said, and use your much better stealth bonus for initiative. Maybe you are a low perception tank build. Well, you can kick down a door and use athletics for initiative as long as you make a reasonable argument to your GM. And there is yet another advantage to using one of these exploration activities or an alternate way of entering initiative. Remember, in the first round of combat, before you've enacted, it's technically up to the GM whether you should be able to use your reactions or not. If the enemy has kind of surprised you, and that is indicated by your bad initiative rolls, it might be fair to say you don't get to use a reaction. But I would say if you were looking ahead and you did use an exploration activity, or you were taking initiative and using a different one of these skills to enter initiative, you definitely should be able to use your reactions. So let's use defend, for example. Well, now you enter with your shield raised, so that's passive AC bonus there. And then I would say, yeah, you get to use the shield block reaction. So just imagine the difference between, yes, having a low initiative roll and then getting attacked multiple times and having multiple attacks hit and taking all that damage, versus saying, I am defending and walking in with a shield raised, having an attack or two miss because of the AC bonus, and then being able to use shield block on another one and then go on a great counterattack into the next round. The second tip is still the fight before the fight. Set up your turn order. Remember, if you tie on initiative with an ally, you get to pick which one of you would like to go first. And also remember, if you do act before another player, you can delay until that player goes, or anytime else in the initiative. So let your supporting players go first. Get buffs, get debuffs. I kind of implicitly talked about this in earlier videos, but now I'm explicitly saying use delay to get buffs and debuffs, get support before you take action. Or don't barge in and mess up a big area of effect. If you are the melee character and you do have higher initiative than your wizard, let's say, just wait. Let the wizard take care of multiple enemies with a big area of effect and then rush in. Or maybe you entered and combat has already broken out and you are in the way of area of effect. Well, wizard, don't blast the ally too. Let the ally go first, get out of the way, and then hit multiple enemies. Look, we all get excited when our roll comes up and we've got a great number and we just want to get going. But remember, you really should think about it as a team and see for whom it makes the most sense to actually go first. And if you need a reminder of the types of priorities, the things you should be doing, go watch my What to Do in Round Number 1 video. On to tip number 3, positioning. Position your team. This was also sort of implicitly talked about in my previous videos, but now we are going to talk about it in detail. Ideally, when positioning your team, something I really like to do is create a false gap. Now, this is a real military tactic where you basically have an intentional break in your lines to try to lure an enemy in, and then that enemy finds themselves surrounded. You also want to look for natural choke points where you can use the focus fire principle of combat to have one enemy coming through, and all of you do that and make sure you combine your choke point with a false gap. If you are out in the open battlefield, there's a really cool kind of formation that I like to set up. Okay, first you're going to start with the hammer, the tank, in the center of your formation, okay? Then one space away, so not immediately next to, but with one space in between, I would have the anvil. I would then have the midguard in between them, one square back, and this creates the false gap between those three. And here you can see that midguard is within touch range of both of those allies and can provide that immediate support, whatever it might be. The midguard also can participate in melee because they're right there. But if the enemy combatants don't step into the false gap, remember the midguard should be able to do just about everything, so they would be able to then strike with a ranged attack from that position as well. Speaking of ranged, I would actually put my ranged fighter out on the flank, not on the back. This is still kind of the same distance from the enemy and your allies, but now you don't have a penalty from cover. Yes, the enemy can reach you without having to go through your melee, but maybe that provokes a reactive strike. And then finally, on the opposite side, I would have your light or fast striker kind of character. This could be your professional, like a rogue or maybe an investigator. And all in all, this is what it looks like. So let's talk about some of the advantages of this. Well, as you can see, both the anvil and your fast striker, your professional, are set up with natural flanking positions with your hammer. Your midguard can support just about everyone. You have a default false gap between the anvil, the midguard, and the hammer, but it is easy to set up another false gap with the fast striker by having the midguard move over. The fast striker can also get behind an enemy to flank with anyone in the front line, and your ranged characters have a clear, unobstructed shot. So take a look at your party and use this formation as a guide and pick what works best for you. You'll have to make some slight adjustments based on the actual characters that you have. And make sure to enter potential combat spaces in formation. Otherwise, your first round is going to be spent just getting in position or fighting very ineffectively out of position. The fourth tip is position your enemies. It's not just you who can move. You can move the enemies too. Did that creature not take the bait and not move into your false gap? You can grapple them. You can reposition them. You can shove them. Grab them by the lapels and put them where you want them. And there are many reasons to do this. You could move an enemy into a position where you can still hit them, but now they are in the first range increment of a ranged ally as well. Or you could move an enemy so that they are no longer in cover for one of your ranged allies. Maybe you could move them in a way, shove them off to a side, so that it would take 2 actions for them to get at your ranged allies, whereas before it would have only taken 1, discouraging that enemy from trying to break through into your second line. There are so many more examples, I won't even go over them all, but just remember, you can draw the battle map not only by moving your tokens, but also by moving the enemy tokens. Tip number 5 also has to deal with positioning, but now we are a little bit more into mid-combat positioning. Tip number 5, up front, melee combatants, move out of the way for the ranged, please. You see, melee marshals typically have pretty easy action economy in the sense that they can stride, strike, or stand there and strike, or, stride, strike, raise a shield, something like that. The point is, not all the time, but they have more often than not one action activities, whereas your casters, more often than not, will have 2 action activities. Almost every cantrip and every spell is going to take 2 actions to cast. And a lot of your ranged marshals will have sort of 2 action activities in the sense that they will need to fire and reload. This means that the upfront melee characters typically have slightly easier action economy, so when it comes to taking a single stride action to line up the best shot, it should actually be the melee characters who are doing it. Another thing that I considered here is that I think a lot of, especially casters, have a better third action than a lot of other builds. This is because casters are going to be wisdom or intelligence based, meaning they will probably be better at recall knowledge than a lot of martial builds. Yes, there are some intelligence based martials as well who will be equally good at that, I know. But then you'll also have charisma based casters, and I know the Thaumaturge is also a martial and it's also charisma based, but just generally speaking here, those charisma-based casters are going to have Demoralize as a good third action. And then many casters have a one-action sustain or buff kind of a thing like Bless or Guidance or Courageous Anthem. So let's think about these 3 combat scenarios, okay? Just thinking about the turns of one of your marshals and one of your casters. In option A, the marshal strikes 3 times and they only hit twice. The caster misses their cantrip due to cover, but then they do use recall knowledge. Okay, that's option A. Option B, that same marshal strikes 3 times, again, only hitting twice. This time the caster strides, so they get into position, and then they do hit with their cantrip. And then option C is the marshal strikes twice, still hits twice, but then uses a stride on their third action. Then the caster no longer has cover, so they hit that cantrip, and now they have another action for recall knowledge. Which is best? It's obviously option C, right? That is the only option that has 2 successful strikes from your martial character, 1 successful strike from your cantrip casting, and a recall knowledge. And it is because rather than swing for the fences on that third action, the marshal took a step out of the way. Marshals, be kind. Retreat. Speaking of how marshals can actually help out their teammates rather than the other way around, tip number 6, debuff with your marshals. The trip, the grapple, shove, and reposition actions are your friends. If you trip a creature, you can leave them prone and off guard to everyone. If you grapple, well, you can also leave them off guard. If you shove, you can move a creature 5 feet, 10 on a critical success. And remember, because I always forget this, you can actually move with them, so you can very drastically redraw the battle lines with this one activity. And then reposition gives you more flexibility in where you want to move that enemy. And I bring this up for marshals specifically because, well, you will have some strength-based marshals, of course, and they are going to be better at these athletics checks. But also remember that as a marshal, as you level up and start adding some potency runes to your weapons, if that weapon has the trip, grapple, shove traits, you can use that weapon for those checks rather than just doing like the hands-free option. And then you will actually get to add the item bonus from that rune to these athletics checks to debuff your enemies. And a bonus tip here, if you happen to know whether the creatures you are fighting have a higher fortitude or reflex DC, change which activity you use. Use shove, grapple, or reposition against a lower fortitude save, but trip against a lower reflex. On to tip number 7, aid. Okay, we all know about aid and how it's better and easier now, but for some reason, we kind of often only think about this with 2 PCs who are right next to each other in melee, and that doesn't have to be the case. There's no reason that you, the upfront martial build, couldn't aid your ranged party members. There's also no reason that those ranged party members can't aid your upfront martial. So if you're upfront and thinking, well, I've already struck twice, and the casters already have a clear line of sight, and I'm dumb, I don't have any intelligence, I've got no skills for recall knowledge, I don't know what to do. Remember, you can still aid that next attack. And conversely, if you are in back and you said, well, I'm a caster and I used my 2-action cantrip and I don't have any 1-action sustains and I've already recalled knowledge and we already know, remember, from the back line, there's no reason you can't aid your front line. And another tip I'm going to include in here, even though it's not technically aid, is that yes, you can aid yourself from range. I mean, no, like I just said, you can't aid yourself. But the point is, from range, it is difficult to set up a creature to be off guard to your attacks. In melee, well, you can move into a flank, you can feint. You don't have those options from range, but you can create a diversion. The text for this does say, if you strike a creature, the creature remains off guard against that attack. So consider that as your first action before you cast a 2-action cantrip or do a reload and fire. On to tip number 8, soften enemies up for your saves. This is very similar to how we ended that previous tip of trying to help out your range builds do a little bit more damage, have a bit more of an effect. A good way to do that is, as a team, lower the saves of enemies and then use spells that target those saves. There are a couple of ways to lower all of the enemy saves, like the Frightened condition or the Sickened condition. Lots of ways to do both, but like Frightened, you could Demoralize. You could use the Fear spell. You could use the Ancestral Oracle Ancestral Touch spell, Devourer of Decay Witch Focus spell, Starless Shadow Witch's familiar ability, or the Dread Ampule Bomb. For the Sickened condition, again, lots of options, but just some: the Devourer of Decay Witch's familiar ability, Resentment Witch's Focus spell, Wildling Steward Witch's Focus spell, Skunk Bomb, Sulfur Bomb, Necrotic Bomb, Tallow Bomb. If you want to target an enemy's reflex save, well, you can impose the Clumsy condition on them. A couple of ways to do that: the Storm Order Druid's Tempest Surge Focus spell, the Hag Sorcerer's Jealous Hex Focus spell, the Dirty Trick feat. One of the Swashbuckler styles comes with that now, though it is just a feat that anybody can pick up, or the Red Pitch Bomb. In order to target and weaken fortitude saves, you can try to impose the Drained condition. The Bones Oracle Soul Siphon spell, which can leave a creature drained, does affect this, as does the Hag Sorcerer's Jealous Hex Focus spell. And then when it comes to will saves, there are a couple of things you can do as well. Bond Mow is a good way to soften up a will save. The Fey Sorcerer Fairy Dust spell and the Psychopomp Sorcerer's Sepulchral Mask Focus spell will do this as well. So what became really apparent in that list is, wow, alchemists, oracles, sorcerers, witches are great debuffers and could pair very well either with their own other abilities or with another spellcaster who can then target those saves. Okay, now on to tip number 9, where we will stick with the spellcasters. I think it works out very well for your spellcaster builds if you are trying to focus on damage to try to pair a save-based effect with an attack. The idea is that you use a 2-action spell cantrip that does not have the attack tag on it, so it does not increase the multiple attack penalty, nor does it suffer the multiple attack penalty. You pair that with a 1-action attack. That way, you are making that attack with no multiple attack penalty, or if you're using that attack first, you are not setting up your next spell for failure. And the best way to do this is to pair a simple weapon or a martial weapon, if you are a character that does have access to martial weapons, like the Bard, with your non-attack cantrips and spells. So some ideas for simple weapons, because that is the majority of spellcasters. The Air Repeater, I think you can use, that has no reload on it, which is quite nice. There are tons of simple weapons with a reload property, and I am talking about range here almost exclusively, just thinking this is a little bit more common for casters. It's very easy to come up with a whole list of weapons. All the other weapons are fine. Have a club if you're going to wade into melee, have a spear, have a knife, whatever. Some martial weapons, though, if you do have access to them, anything in the bow category does not have reload on it. So you can be a bard using a spell and then a short bow just over and over and over again. And then, there are some ancestry feats like the Leshy Seed Pod and the Kitsune Foxfire that give you an unarmed ranged attack as well. And finally, we're closing out with tip number 10, and we are mostly returning to martials here, though this does apply to spellcasters as well, but more so to martials. Know when to hit hard and when to hit often. A lot of characters sort of have two fundamentally different things they can do on their turn. They can use a multiple action, powerful ability, or use multiple less powerful abilities. So which is better? The first thing I suggest doing is mathing it out for your particular build. And generally, you will find that a 2-action powerful attack tends to average a little bit more damage under normalized circumstances. Tends to. Let's take a look at some examples. So a D10 +4 fighter who has Vicious Swing is going to do better with Vicious Swing than they would with 2 attacks. With Vicious Swing, you will average 8.25 points of damage when you need an 11 to hit on that first attack. If that is 2 attacks, that average actually goes down to 8.075. So you can see Vicious Swing is better here. But let's look at another example of a kineticist who is also going to be doing some melee damage. They have a D8 Impulse, their Elemental Blast, +4 Con, +3 Strength. In this case, using 2 1-action Elemental Blasts is actually better than 1 2-action. This surprised me. That 1 2-action melee blast will average 6.325 points of damage, whereas the 2 1-action blasts actually average a bit more at 6.375. I've been playing my kineticist wrong this whole time. So if all things are equal, go for whatever does the most average damage for your particular build. But what about if things are not equal? Let's say you are fighting something with a resistance or a hardness. In this case, even if multiple attacks does technically average more for you, you instead want to hit once and try to hit hard to get through that resistance, get through that hardness. But what about a creature that is, light and wispy? It doesn't have a lot of hit points, but it is very hard to hit. Well, you don't need to hit it hard, but you do need to hit it. So don't use those big 2-action abilities that often increase your map by both increments, leaving you with a terrible third strike if you try to do that. And instead, swing multiple 1-action abilities and just try to hit this thing and do the little bits of damage that is needed to take it down. The point is, you need to know what you are trying to achieve in this particular combat, in this particular round, and change your attack options to best suit that goal. All right, adventurers, we've done it for now. A combat basics video, 3 rounds of combat, and some advanced tips. But I bet there's more to cover, and I bet I missed something or messed something up, so let's talk about it in the comments. Until then, remember that great teamwork, exciting builds, and solid tactics won't necessarily ensure your success, but at least if you are doing everything right, you can blame your failures solely on the dice.